Welcome to another episode Beyond Perception. I'm Simon, and it's my joy to welcome Cal Washington as my guest today. Cal, we had our first conversation almost 2 years ago. And just to introduce you briefly to our audience, you are the co-founder and CEO of Inpower, which is a worldwide movement with a mission to put communities back in power. You are the author of the Notice of Liability, a document to really get out of contracts one has inadvertently agreed to. And from what I know, your goal is really to bless people and to empower them. That's a wonderful thing. So I'm really excited to have you here again for another conversation. Welcome, Cal.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored to be here. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, likewise. So I'm just referencing our first conversation ago, our first conversation 2 years ago, where you really introduced us to the concept of free will and how it relates to our legal system, but also not just our legal system, but you could say underlying principles. You made a connection to the Bible. You also introduced us to the nature of contracts and far more than that. So I just want to share that with our audience. So if you don't know the first conversation, I strongly encourage you to watch this episode. It's number 53. And that said, nevertheless, Cal, could you just establish a basic introduction to what's commercial law, what's merchant law, and how it relates to our legal system?
Okay, well, merchant law is ancient, and it appears that it was introduced here, going back to in antiquity into Hammurabi, the time of Hammurabi. If you look at the Hammurabi Code, you will see some very advanced banking ideas, although they didn't have cash at that time. They were still trading in commodities like grain or cows or whatever it was, like the actual things. But they still have these concepts that are still in place today, and they're pretty advanced. It's advanced investments and things when things fail and all that stuff is all kind of things that we do now in the stock market, investing or in borrowing and lending, like banking ideas. So it's old, and it's older than it should be, put it that way. Because if you haven't even evolved to the place where you're using money, why do you have these advanced banking ideas, right? So there's something more going on with all of this. Banking isn't a new thing, and it probably shouldn't even be here, in my opinion.
So basically, what you're saying, the idea of banking was there before we used money.
Yes. So you would have to have pre-knowledge of that in order for these ideas to come forward. Like you would have to understand money from somewhere else. Like you would have to have that. The history, the way we're told, it doesn't make any sense.
Mm-hmm.
That ancient people that didn't have any money also had laws that were advanced like that. So going into the Middle Ages, when they started putting goods in large boats and a lot of international trade started happening, instantly there was going to be some problems if there was anything that went wrong, like whose country, what laws, So a lot of this merchant type law was outside the idea of countries. It kind of operated worldwide, and everybody kind of understood what it was, even though it wasn't written down. Some of the admiralty stuff was written down. There's a few old books about admiralty law, in particular with the shipping. But the merchants on the land, it was done by principles and customs and agreements of how things were going to go and how you're going to adjudicate any issues of something going wrong with a contract or a deal or stealing or whatever it was. So it was very informal, and to begin with. Then it got a little more formal in England, in the staple towns, where there were certain port towns where a lot of ships came in, and then certain staples were there, like wool or grain or potatoes or whatever it was. There was, they had kind of a place where it all kind of happened. That's where you could go and get wool, and everybody sent their stuff there, right? It's kind of like that. So then the staple courts popped up in these staple towns, and they were a little more formal. Like there was a building. The other ones were done at the fair under a tent or whatever. Like it was just very, the merchants kind of ran it themselves. So now you have a mayor kind of running the staple court. And then there was a lot of going back and forth. I'm talking more about England, but between the King's courts, the Admiralty courts, and the law merchant courts, and who was running everything, because a lot of goods came on, they left the land, went on a ship, then went back to the land. So like, where did one thing start, one and the other stop? So there was a lot of overlap and even competition. Mm-hmm. And then Lord Mansfield in the 1700s fused everything into the common law courts. So all of those two other jurisdictions ended up in the same court building, even though they were running Admiralty courts or law merchant courts. It was done in the main courthouses under the same judges that would be running common law courts. Yeah. So that everybody understood it at that time, going back 300 years or so. But over time, they stopped talking about it. They stopped teaching it in law school. It's still operating, but we don't know that it's operating there. So a lot of people have figured out that there's some kind of admiralty thing going on. So you hear that a lot, but nobody's talking about law merchant. And that's the key to understanding what's really going on and how money works and commercial instruments and all that, because that's the jurisdiction where all that operates. It doesn't operate in admiralty. So they'll let you talk about admiralty, but they don't want you talking about law merchant. So that's what I do. I try and teach people to be aware of law merchant, number one, and then to try and figure out what's going on. And then when you see it in the court, you start to be able to recognize when they moved into law merchant.
And as you mentioned, admiralty law, you hear quite frequent. Could you just present what this is about and how it differentiates to what law merchant is about?
Well, admiralty has to do with ships on the water. Everything has to do with water. So it's about shipping, it's about ships themselves, and it's about the crew, the captain. Like there's just a lot of rules about how everything is going to operate on the water. So that's why when you're on a boat, a captain can marry you, because it's a whole other jurisdiction. Once you're on a boat on the water, you're in a different jurisdiction than you were on the land, and all the land laws don't apply anymore. Some of them would, like murder and that kind of thing, but generally speaking, you have moved out of one jurisdiction and into another. And so a lot of people have figured this out, that the court moves into admiralty, and it does, but they haven't figured out that it moves in law merchant. So law merchant was more about the rules for commerce on the land. That's where the international fairs were, and they had these pie powder courts, which were the courts at the fairs or at the marketplaces, and they just dealt with that. They couldn't deal with things outside of that, but just for the merchants and the marketplaces. And that was how everything was done. But again, law merchant moved very quickly. Like you would if there was a problem in the morning, you had a judgment by the afternoon. Where if you took that same problem to the King's courts, number one, you might not get it heard for a month, and then it would take another 2 months of arguing back and forth and trying to come up with all the proof of this and that and everything else. Where law merchant moved very quickly, just like, let's get to the truth and let's just, and so people like that rather than trying to go into the King's court. So there was some competition there.
And also what you shared in the first conversation, it's a very honorable system. And also what you're just saying, it's very efficient. It's based on truth. Would you agree to that?
Well, that's what they say. I mean, I'm sure there's going to be corruption just because of the human, the way things are. But by and large, it was built on let's get to the truth of the matter. Even if we can't prove it, everybody knows you stole the thing. Like, we don't have to bring in 15 witnesses and all. Like, you can, if you use common sense, you can get to the root of the problem and deal with it fast. So for the Admiralty people, or anybody that had anything to do with a ship, if you had a dispute with something that was on a ship, that ship could be leaving at high tide, and you may never see it again. So you had to have something dealt with. You couldn't just put a petition into the King's Court and then wait 5 years till that ship shows up, because it'll have a different crew and different captain and who knows, right? So, so people liked the pie powder courts and the staple courts. They moved very quickly and got things done. And judgment was swift.
And before you said, not really a lot of people know how money works. How is law merchant connected, if it is, to money, and what are we missing about the idea of money, or the
the merchant class were allowed to write what we would call credit notes. So they were able to do promissory notes, and in particular bills of exchange. And bills of exchange are money, but only the merchant class could do these things. So it was only for merchants. Only it wasn't for the common person. But that idea of these commercial instruments is how our money is now. Like, everything is a promise to pay. It's a piece of paper. We're not dealing in pieces of silver anymore. You get a piece of paper that used to represent the silver, and so you could carry that piece of paper around, and then you would be able to redeem it at any point in time back to the person who wrote the credit note. And so everybody was fine with that. But now your pieces of paper, other than maybe the Russian rubles and a few people that are now trying to put them on gold, there is nothing backing them. Like, they are literally fictitious as far as anything behind them. They have a face value, and we believe that a $20 note or a 20 franc note or whatever it is has that value, but there is nothing to get with it. It's just a piece of paper. So that ancient system for the merchants is prevalent in our society now. We just can't see it for what it is. That's why they don't want you learning about law merchant, because as soon as you get into law merchant, that's when you start to learn about bills of exchange, and then the light bulbs will start to go off, and you'll start to see what's really going on here.
And if you can also just share briefly, what's the problem? What's the effect of us not understanding law merchant or knowing about it?
Well, if you understand about the birth certificate, a lot of people say that you've been turned into a corporation with the law, with the capitalized name. It's closer to understand it that you've been turned into a merchant, not a corporation. And so what has happened, like I said, these instruments, commercial instruments, were for merchants only. Well, they just turned everybody into a merchant and didn't tell them. So now merchant law applies to each one of us, and our signature on a piece of paper can be turned into money because we're merchants. We just don't understand it. So we're being taken advantage of all over the place, where you're signing things and they're taking it as, oh, you promised to pay this. Okay, I'll turn that into money. And so the banks are and the stock market and mortgages, all that stuff is built up upon your promise to pay. But they take advantage of the money that's created on the spot at that point. So that's why they don't want you learning about law merchant, because that's how they're operating. They need to keep that hidden. So that's why I try and tell everybody, look at law merchant, study it, figure it out, you'll start to connect some dots.
What you're saying is we are consenting to be treated as merchants without us knowing about how the rule book of a merchant looks like, and so
Yes.
we are being taken advantage of, basically.
Yeah. I'll just show you a Canadian act here. So this, because it's commerce, anything that's happening in Canada has to happen in the rest of the world. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
So, really understand that. So this is the Financial Administration Act. This is an act dealing with money and the government. For what that's what it's for. So very few people know about this act. But here's the definitions section. Just so they can get away with this, they define money. Money includes negotiable instruments. And then negotiable instruments, which is the next definition, includes checks, which most people know about. But as generations go by, people aren't even going to know what a check is anymore because they're just not used. They're getting us away from all that stuff. Draft, traveler's check. Some of us, like older people, know about that. And here's the one where nobody knows about: a bill of exchange. Like, what is that? But that's money. So a bill of exchange is a negotiable instrument, and a negotiable instrument is money. So these pieces of paper are money for those that understand how it works. And that's the key to understanding what's going on in the world. And as you dive into this information, you will start to see it. You'll start to see people asking you to sign stuff, and you're like, "Oh, why are you asking for my signature?" And then you'll look at the paper and going, "Oh, you're creating a bill of exchange here, and it's got my name on it, and you're getting the money for it." So they're turning things into money off your signature. So I'll just show you another one. So everybody understands now that a bill of exchange is money. And here is the Bills of Exchange Act. I'll just open this up now. So this is another Canadian act. Again, because it's dealing with money at this level, and there's Bills of Exchange Acts all over the world. Any Commonwealth country will have a Bills of Exchange Act, including Hong Kong, like previous things that England had. So like Hong Kong has one, some of the Caribbean islands, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera.
But then also non-Commonwealth countries have similar instruments.
Yes, because it's worldwide and it's old. That's why we, I said this stuff goes way, long before any of us were born. So we have to understand that this is what's happened. And then they just stopped teaching it and stopped talking about it. And it's just become hidden. It's hidden in plain view. So a bill of exchange is money, and here's the extreme of it. Where a simple signature, so that's again somebody signs something on a blank paper. So if there's a blank piece of paper with a signature on it, delivered by the signer in order that it may be converted into a bill, that's a bill of exchange, and you may not know that it's been. This is what I'm saying. So back in the
absence of evidence to the contrary.
Yeah. So if you don't have any words saying non-negotiable or something like that, it has as an authority to fill up as a complete bill of exchange for any amount, using the signature for that of the drawer or acceptor or an endorser. Like if you have a blank piece of paper with your signature on it, somebody could turn this into money. So in like manner, when the bill is wanting in any material particular, the person in possession of it has, in the absence of evidence to the contrary, the authority to fill up the omission in any way he thinks fit.
Okay.
So when you're signing things, somebody could, after you've signed it, could write in whatever they want, any amount, and turn it into money. This is what they don't want you to know. Yeah,
you don't know what to say at first. Maybe at second as well. I don't know. Yeah. So what would you say is the most important thing for people to recognize or to wake up to? That
law merchant, or lex mercatoria in Latin, or the jus gentium in the civil law. That's where it's mostly written there. So you've got to be aware that there's this commercial system that's very old that nobody's talking about, but it's still running. They just have hidden it.
So you basically have to assume that everything which is introduced to you, may it be policies or laws or whatever, is an invitation to a commercial activity. It's a contractual offer.
Absolutely.
And it's on you to decide how you want to react to that.
Yeah, so you have to be aware, because like I just showed you, if you don't understand what's going on and you put your signature on a piece of paper, it can be turned into money. So you have to once you understand what's going on, you'll start to see how this has been happening to you in your life, all your adult life mostly. And the credit card idea is the quintessential thing where when we had credit cards back when they first came out, so you have to be of a certain age to understand this, but you would go to the restaurant and you had your card, and your name was on there, and it was raised off the card, like it was embossed, and you had a number, and then there was a date, expiry date, all that stuff. So when you go to the restaurant, after you're done, you would hand the waiter your card. He would take your card, he would put it in a machine, a piece of paper on top, and it had 3 copies, and then he would run the thing over it. And then so that the imprint of your card would go onto the papers, and he would write in the amount of the dinner you had and the date, and then he would bring it back to you, and then you would sign it. You just created a bill of exchange. So you created the money on the spot at the restaurant. The restaurant takes the top copy. The top copy, middle copy went to you as a receipt, and then they take the other 2 copies, and then the restaurant just puts it in their bank. They don't send it to the credit card company. That's the impression we get, but they don't. They actually just put it in their deposit along with their cash, and their bank account goes up instantly by that much. The credit card company is informed that this has happened, and then they charge the customer 100% of the money that they created. They're charging you again in fiat dollars plus interest. It's the biggest scam ever, because you're the one creating the money, but they are getting 100% of the deal, and the restaurant's getting paid as well. So the credit card company does not pay the restaurant. So you can see, after years and years of people doing this, the amount of money that the banks are making is astronomical. And they don't want you to understand this, because this is their big fraud, their big scam, their big game that they're playing. And this goes back. I'll just share another document. So this is the Hudson Bay Company, which started in 1600s and ran in Canada. It wasn't called Canada back then. It was called Rupert's Land. There was 4 provinces, and then there was Rupert's Land, which is all owned by the Hudson Bay Company. and every transaction had to go through the Hudson Bay Company at their fort, so you couldn't deal with the native people directly. They had to get a cut of everything. And so they bought a lot of beaver pelts, etc., and then they turned them into coats and sold them in Europe. And everything was in silver at that time. So this is how they paid for their beaver pelts: a piece of paper with signatures on it. These are these instruments, and this is what a current dollar bill or franc, any piece of paper that are money, you'll see these things on there. You'll see a signature on there. That's because it's a bill of exchange. They don't want you to understand this. So this is a promise to pay the bearer, which means whoever has this piece of paper. So I can have it, and then I can give it to you, and whoever has it on demand, to pay on demand the bearer 1 pound of silver. But you had to take it to the factory in where Ontario is now, York. And this is pre cars or planes or anything like that. So you walked. You either had a horse or you walked, or you had a canoe. So you had to go to the York factory, and when you got there, they would give you a bill of exchange. Here's that word again. So this is very common back then, but we don't know what they are anymore because they just don't talk about them. But there's a Bills of Exchange Act in so many countries. But does anybody know what a bill of exchange is? No, even lawyers. So you would given a bill of exchange payable 60 days after sight, which means after you present the bill, they had 60 days to come up with this pound of silver. But you had to take it to the Hudson Bay House in London, England. So very few of these ever made it back to London, England, to actually get the silver. So if you had this kind of scam going on where you're buying stuff and you're just, here's a pound of silver, here's a pound of silver, here's 5 shillings, and you're getting all this goods, and then you turn them into jackets and then you sell them for actual silver, how rich are you going to get? You see, this is how the merchants operate. Now, in the 30s, they turned us into merchants. So not only are they doing this, they've got us doing it, but they're taking advantage of what we're doing. That's the scam.
And that's where you and your Inpower platform and the Notice of Liability comes into place.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. YouTube decided that the remaining part of this conversation is not in line with its community guidelines. In other words, it's censored the content. That's why you have to continue watching this episode on Rumble. You will find the link down in the description. I strongly encourage you to watch it fully because you will better understand how merchant law shapes our world and why it's a legal system you've never heard of, for example, because of censorship like this one. Please enjoy.